Last week on Locked On Dolphins, we did a deep dive exploring 14 of the top prospects in the 2025 NFL Draft and their fit with the Dolphins. Now it's time to stack the board. We got that coming your way here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and the NFL Draft lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. Here on the Locked On Network today on the show, you guys are in for a treat because we're taking the 14 players that we looked at last week on the show, and it's time to stack them. And the process of stacking players, as it pertains to how the NFL landscape does it, it's not just as simple as like a draft analyst big board of 1 through 16. Although we do have that available for us here today on the show that we're going to review. But the conversation about what players fitting in what tiers across multiple positions, and then when the team comes on the clock, sometimes it is simple as there's one player in a tier all by himself, and that makes a very easy best player available conversation. But more often than not, there's more layers to it than that, and that's sometimes why you see the teams exhaust the full length of their time on the clock before finalizing a pick to just kind of go over some things and make sure that they are all convicted in the decision that they are making. So the first thing that has to happen for how my process works, and we're going to talk about my process here for just a second, is I do, of course, do player evaluations for the 33rd team. And that process of grading players is 10 traits, and they are all equally weighted because I'm not grading for a specific scheme. And you give the players it's a 1 through 10, but it's really a 1 through 5 because 5 is a passing grade, and anything below a 68 is an undrafted free agent grade on a 100-point scale. But you give the players across those 10 traits a score. And the higher the score, the better it is. The better your overall output is, the higher your overall grade is, right? It's pretty simple stuff. But if I'm going to do the coverage for the Dolphins, I don't want to use my universal big board that I'm using with grades that aren't tailored to a scheme, because that doesn't give me the most tailored rankings that are appropriate for the Dolphins and the kind of defense that they run and the kind of offense that they run and the traits that are more important to run some of those than others. So what happens is I take those 10 traits and I put them into tiers, and the higher your tier, the more weight your final grade is carried in how well or poorly you score in those must-have traits that are necessary to execute the kind of offense or defense that the Dolphins want to run. So I have almost 250 players graded at this point. We're going to look at the top 16 after I've tailored all of the positions for the Dolphins. Most of these players, not all of them, but most of these players are players that we looked at this past week on Locked On Dolphins. So if I were to stack my board, tailoring my universal grades for the Dolphins, Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter, 1-2. Shouldn't be a real big surprise there. But then you have names like Josh Simmons, offensive tackle from Ohio State, dealing with a patellar tendon tear that has a medical concern. And that this, if you're watching on YouTube, his name in yellow is an indicator that there's an injury question with the player. That might be enough in a real-life situation to take him off the board for the Dolphins. I can't make that determination for myself, and I'm grading to have all the players reflected. So Josh Simmons, very highly ranked, so much so he actually is tied with Jahdae Barron, the corner defensive back from Texas. And then Mason Graham finishes out the top 5. Those are my top 5 players, taking my universal grades for this draft class and putting filters on that are meant to tailor the positional or needs to execute the offense. I'll finish the rest of the top 16, and then we'll talk about kind of the challenges with some of these players. And not necessarily coveting them in order of 1 through 16, because a lot of these guys are very closely graded. Will Johnson, corner from Michigan, sits at 6. Tyler Warren, tight end from Penn State at 7. Ashton Jeanty, running back from Boise State, sits at number 8. Malaki Starks, safety, Georgia, number 9. Will Campbell, offensive guard, LSU Tigers, and number 10. Armand Membu, who for the Dolphins, I am grading as a guard because we're grading for the Dolphin scheme, sits at number 11, ironically enough, scores below Will Campbell with a projection to guard. Kenneth Grant, defensive tackle from Michigan, sits at 12. Mike Green, pass rusher with some off-the-field questions, so his name is in red to indicate kind of an off-the-field concern that could be a disqualifier and potentially remove you completely from the board, sits at 13. Safety Nick Eamon-Wari from South Carolina at 14. Shamar Stewart, defensive lineman from Texas A&M at 15. And then Savon Revel, it's pronounced Savon, from East Carolina, coming off of a season-ending injury after 3 weeks last year, another knee injury. So there's another injury tag there for him. He sits at number 16. So those are my top 16 players on the board for the Dolphin scheme. These are the 16 players that either have a top 10 overall grade, and I have one player who's in a tier all by himself, and that's Travis Hunter. He scores almost 5 points better than the next best player, which is Abdul Carter. I have him that highly coveted as a player. Of course, that's not a player that's going to be on the board for the Dolphins. And I think you can look at this top 16 and say Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter, Mason Graham, Ashton Jeanty, probably, but not guaranteed, Armand Membu. Those 5 names are expected to be locks to be gone. And then you also have 2 players with injury tags in Savon Revel and Josh Simmons that you're potentially removing off the board. And you have Mike Green with a character question where he discussed this at the NFL Combine, but on 2 separate occasions, both in high school and during his time at Virginia, was accused of sexual assault. And no charges came out of those incidences, but teams are going to have to do their own vetting on that situation and be comfortable with the answers that they have. And if you're not for the Dolphins, that's half of the names. That's 8 names as far as probably going to be gone or a lock to be gone in the case of Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter. These guys are locks to be gone. Or potentially off the board for disqualifying variables that you don't feel comfortable with the answers for medically or with personal background questions. That's one piece of this puzzle. There's also the positional value debate that happens. So stacking this 1 through 16 is one thing, but you have players 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 14 are playing quote-unquote non-premium positions with an air quote. Well, that's a tight end, a running back, 2 safeties, and 2 guards. So if you're looking for who successfully checks all the boxes and is expected to be on the board when we pick at 13, it's a much more narrow list than just 1 through 16 and lop the names off as they come off the board. Now, you could tell me if you're comfortable with the answers that are required to be found medically or background-wise, or if you have a very specific role for a safety like an Eamon-Wari or a Malaki Starks like we talked about, or a Tyler Warren, and that's, if you're going to pivot from Tyreek Hill, who ordered his latest order of attention this past weekend with his subtweets or whatever on social media, whatever that looks like, you can be comfortable with, and I would be excited about the prospect of adding the talent of any of those 16 names to the list. And there's other names that I think respectively, you could get excited about as well. We covered names that weren't on this list last week. We talked about Derek Harmon. We talked about Jihad Campbell. We talked about, Kelvin Banks, right? Those are the kinds of players that we talked about and spotlighted. But if they don't rank this high for me now, then I'm probably going to be a proponent of the idea of, hey, maybe that's if you can facilitate a trade down opportunity. Those are the names that I think maybe a little bit later in the first round, you could feel like you're getting appropriate value for. But we have to not just stack this 1 through 16. You got to illustrate them into tiers and talk about the tiers and how that separation exists for the decision the Dolphins will have when they come on the board. We're going to talk about that next here on Locked On Dolphins. So make sure that you guys stick with us. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet with FanDuel wins. That's $200, 200 extra bucks that you can use on everything from buzzer beaters, the Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the nets at the end of it all. You've got your eye on one of these 1 seeds. It's a pretty chalk through the Final Four. FanDuel makes it easy to back whoever your favorite pick is with spreads, game totals, and props. And with tournament games that have happened on almost every day, there's been nonstop action for you to stay in on the game on for yourself. The FanDuel app is simple and easy to use. When you win, you get paid instantly. There's no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com to get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. So the concept here that I want to go over is that of a horizontal big board, which is how teams in their draft rooms stack players. In a horizontal board, you read it left to right, just like you would a book. And each column is a position. And then horizontally are the tiers of top 10 grades and first round grades and late 1, early 2s and second round grades, and so on and forth. And ideally, if you're picking at 13, you're getting either a top 10 grade or you are getting a first round grade. Now, if you're picking at 25 and you had 15 first round grades and they're all off the board, now you're into the late 1, early 2. What could get very dicey, unfortunately, the numbers are going to be supportive for the Dolphins that they're not going to have this conflict. It's mathematically guaranteed. Even if every name goes off the board that was on that list of 1 through 16. I have 16 first-round grades for the Dolphins, and they pick 13th. They're not going to be positioned. If they pick 17th and your 16 first-round picks were gone, and you're looking at your best available players were graded as late 1, early 2s at 17, you're probably not going to get appropriate value for your selection based on your own valuation of the players. But when you come on the clock, it's not just as simple as, well, who's number 1 on the board? Sometimes it is. Other times, it can be helpful to have things laid out for you to read in this horizontal big board presentation. And this is a thing that we did last year for Touchdown Miami. That was a really big, successful hit on Substack. And it's going to be available again this year with an extra 100 names than what we had last year. But it's replicating an NFL draft board with these grades in the tiers that you can read from left to right. So with the grade that Travis Hunter has as a corner, I'm grading him as a corner, but he's a corner wide receiver. Right? He could be either one. He is the only player in the tier of top 10 overall grades. So if you were to come on the clock and Travis Hunter's on the board, based off of what I have, my selection would be Travis Hunter, period. No questions asked. The next tier of first-round grades is the other 15 players, but I do have kind of a delineating line that divides this tier based on how I grade NFL players. So Tyler Warren, Josh Simmons, Armand Membu, Will Campbell, Mason Graham, Abdul Carter, Jahdae Barron, Will Johnson, Malaki Starks. Those grades for me are a sub-tier different than the grades that I gave Kenneth Grant, Nikki Minwari, Shamar Stewart, Mike Green, and Savon Revel. So I am wanting to get on the board if I'm the Dolphins right now. When it's time for them to come up on the board, I am wanting one of the upper tier of the first round grades to be available. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 names. 9, if you include Ashton Genty, excuse me. So 9 names. Out of that group, we're expecting Armand Membu to be off the board. We're expecting Mason Graham and Abdul Carter to be off the board. So really you have a short list of 6 names that I think are special first-round grade talents that are good enough to warrant. And right now, if you are watching on YouTube, I only have the top 16 grades illustrated. I've got a whole other tier down here that's just hidden columns right now because I want to keep the main thing. You got a list of what I think is 6 names in Genty, Tyler Warren, Josh Simmons with a medical tag, Will Campbell, 1, 2, 3, 4, Jahdae Barron, Will Johnson, Malaki Starks. So that's 7 because I'm expecting Mason Graham, Abdul Carter, and Armand Membu to be gone. It makes for a much more whittled list. And if you reflect on how the grades change based on me grading them for the Dolphins scheme, names like Tyler Warren, Jahdae Barron, Nick Eamon-Wari were players, Malaki Starks even, were players whose universal grade was lower than the Dolphins' tailored grade. So those are players that stand out to me as being particularly good scheme fits for the Dolphins. Whereas Shamar Stewart, Ashton Genty, even Armand Membu to some degree, projecting him inside at guard. Their actual grades for the Dolphins scheme came down versus what I graded them without putting the filter of traits on what mattered the most for the scheme that the Dolphins are going to run. So you can kind of get the feel. There's a lot of layers here that go into this, and that's before you get into, okay, you're drafting for need. Are you drafting for need? Are you going to swear off need altogether, which is kind of honestly what I would prefer to do, because I want this player at 13 to be a marquee fit for what you're going to do. But when it's tightly bunched like this, and a lot of these grades are close, you could take and hold any of these names in this tier: Genty, Warren, Simmons, Membu, Campbell, Graham, Carter, Barron, Johnson, Starks. Any of those guys in that tier are graded closely enough together that I think that's where the door is open for you to have a on-the-clock conversation about who you were best convicted with your interviews, who doesn't have incomplete numbers for their athletic profile. Like Tyler Warren hasn't tested. Josh Simmons isn't going to test and has a medical flag. Will Johnson has yet to test. Those players, if you have incomplete information there, does that matter to you? Jahdae Barron's an older player. Does that matter to you? Versus the Will Campbells of the world if he's on the board. And look, you might live in a world where all of these players are off the board. I don't think it's crazy to think that of your ideal, Travis Hunter in a tier by himself, and then the other 10 names. I'd be surprised if that's the draw that you got on the board because you're expecting quarterbacks to go. But you could tell me Genty, Warren, Membu, Campbell, Graham, Carter, Barron, Johnson, potentially Starks are all gone, and Josh Simmons is off people's boards that early in the draft because of the medical questions. I wouldn't bat an eye. In which case, now you're knocked down into the second tier that's Grant, Stewart, Nick Eamon-Wari. So it's a really interesting kind of illustration of the grades that I wouldn't bat an eye at any of them in the respective tiers for them to be the pick. Now, who do I think you don't trade away from? It's been one of the popular questions that I've been given. We're going to get into that specific question next here on Locked On Dolphins, so make sure you guys stick with us. Here's what I would say about how to handle the prospect of trading out. I'm going to pull back up, if you're watching on YouTube, the list of the top 16 again. I would want one of these players if I were the Dolphins. So this is, and you can probably put the two big medical flags and the off-field flag you could remove them off the list, and that gives you 13 names. Right. So that, to me, guarantees 13 names of Hunter, Carter, Barron, Graham, Johnson, Warren, Genty, Starks, Campbell, Membu, Grant, Eamon, Worry, Shamar, Stewart. And if they picked Josh Simmons, amazing. I think he's an amazing offensive tackle prospect that can play inside at guard. And I know we didn't do a deep dive on him, but it's because predictably, I think he is going to go a little later because of the medical stuff. And he was a player that had a big breakout, but the big breakout was only 6 games large this year. As a player who was formerly at San Diego State and transferred to Ohio State and had some penalty issues. There's just not a large proven body of work, but man, what he put on tape this year was electric and would be an amazing fit, even if it's inside a guard. Savon Revel, small school, was raw prior to this year, had some ball skills questions. I'm buying in on the upside in a big, big, big way with him, but I would not be surprised predictively if you get to the NFL draft and Revel does not go in the first round because he's a small school player without a complete athletic profile who needed to make some big technical leaps this year and showcase more ball production. And it looked like he was going to do that, but it got cut short prematurely because he tore his ACL in practice. And then the Mike Green character stuff is really just a total wild card that if you told me he's completely off your board, I would understand it because you're not comfortable with that situation. Or you could tell me, whatever background information you are completely comfortable with. And if you're just looking at the football player and you're not concerned about the off the field stuff, an amazing pass rush talent, right? So those 3 players can break either way. But the other 13 on the list that don't have the questions, that's my do not trade away from list. So how do you get here, right? The question becomes, what other names get drafted inside the top 12 that would make this list be as large as possible? Do you see Mykel Williams from Georgia go in the top 12? Do you see, obviously, 2 quarterbacks, potentially 3 quarterbacks go in the top 12? Whether that's just Cam Ward, that's Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, is that Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders, and Jackson Dart? Do you get a wide receiver? Does Matthew Golden or Ted McMillan go in the top 12? I don't covet those players for the Dolphins the way that, and I'm this is just me. And this is me on my show trying to apply the principles and the school of thought and the football education that I have and trying to apply to the Dolphins without knowing explicitly what direction that they want to go. What are they trying to be this year? I think there's some great context clues in the personnel moves that they've made. But what happens if you get 3 quarterbacks and you get Mykel Williams and you get Ted McMillan? Well, that's almost half of the top 12. Now, all of a sudden, you could be having a list of, if you're including all 16 names that I have here, you could be looking at 8 players available off of this list. And if you had a list of, you had 8 names on this list that's available at 13, I'd be willing to go down at least 7 spots, right? And that's where I think, for me, you can play the math game of how many players are on the board that you covet within the pick area that you have. I have 16 first-round grades. I want to mathematically guarantee, as I maneuver my way around the board, that I at least have one of those available to me whenever I make my pick. Now, if it gets super scarce and they strike Simmons and Revel and Green off the board and they have 13 names and 12 of them go in the 12 picks in front of you, then I'm staying at 13 and I'm picking the last name there because I feel like it's appropriate value, regardless of who it is. Whether it's Nick Worry or whether it's Ashton Genty or whether it's Tyler Warren or whether it's Will Campbell. But that's how I want to play the game with the board, because it's not just plucking daisies for needs on your roster. This is farming talent that is going to be transformative talent for not just this year, but long term. And the Dolphins are not operating as though they are on the hottest of seats. Now, you want to get good ROI, you want to get good return on investment, and the way that you do that is by picking great players that are good fits for your scheme. That is the list for me. Now, who is the player, like, even if you had 8 names on the board that you unequivocally don't trade out of? I would probably say it's at the top, really the top 2 names. I have 2 names that are graded separately and have significant separation from the rest of the field. It's Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter. Those guys are going in the top 5. So I don't think there's a world in which I am living in coming into this draft, for me personally and my mentality for the Dolphins, that says no matter what, you have to stay at 13. I'm going to let the board dictate that for me. Because if I like the value and the depth of the value that's available based off the players that I have graded with first-round grades. Now, if somebody exists in the sub-tier of first-round grades that I have that's above the second sub-tier of first-round grades that I have, I would prefer to take a player in the upper tier. But if all of the players that exist happen to be in the same tier of talent that's available, Kenneth Grant, Shamar Stewart, Nick Eamon-Warry, Mike Green, and Savon Rebel as kind of the lower portion, the lower bracket of the first round grades that I gave out. I think you can make a great case for Kenneth Grant as the best player available in that scenario. I think you can make a great case for Nick Eamon-Warry being the best scheme fit, because his grade came up the highest out of that lower bracket of players that were ranked 12 through 16. Kind of the divider for me is 84 out of 100. If you're above an 84 out of 100, you go in the upper tier first round grades. And if you're below an 84 out of 100, you go in the second tier first round grades. But I feel pretty good. You're going to have at least one player in that upper tier that graded 84 or better, which is Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter, Josh Simmons, Jahdae Barron, Mason Graham, Will Johnson, Tyler Warren, Ashton Genty, Malaki Starks, Will Campbell, Armand Membu. I feel pretty good you're going to have at least one name off of that group, in which case that's probably your appropriate value to stick and pick. And even Barron and Will Johnson, Jahdae Barron's ranked 4th on the vertical board, and Will Johnson's ranked 6th on the vertical board. But when you look at it from a horizontal presentation, I mean, they are right next to each other. So then the question is not necessarily, okay, we want to take a corner here. Barron's ranked higher by 0.4 points, so we're going to take Jahdae Barron. Well, the question then becomes, what's more important to us? What do we have a better vision for? Do we have a better vision for a player who's going to play on the outside and allows us to interchangeably move the other pieces? Or is it more, we want a player that's going to blur the lines between a safety and a nickel and a corner all the time? Because if that's the case, then Jahdae Barron and versatility is kind of the divider for me with these two players and their grades. Because if I'm just looking at the coverage profile, I think Will Johnson's a better player. But when you add the versatility element that we are perceiving to be very important for the Dolphins in their scheme, that for me is where I think Jahdae Barron has a big edge. And if it matters more in this scheme than an average scheme across the league for a corner, that's why Barron ranks above Will Johnson. And you could apply that anywhere along the space, right? So that's my hit list at 13. That's where my frame of mind is at. I want one of these 16 players, really one of these 13 players, because, from a medical standpoint and an off the field standpoint, you want to strike those names from the ledger and say, look, we just don't have the answers we need here. I'm going to say, okay, Hunter, Carter, Barron, Graham, Johnson, Warren, Genty, Starks, Campbell, Membu, Grant, Eamon-Warry, Stewart. You're guaranteed at least one on the board. Make it happen. Love this stuff. And again, on Touchdown Miami, before probably 2 weeks from now, the full 300-player board is going to go up if you watched on YouTube. And if you didn't watch on YouTube, swing over to YouTube and check it out. Or if you don't and you want to look over on Touchdown Miami on Substack, last year's was the most popular piece we did last year. And can still be found in the recommended reads because of how popular it was versus everything else that I did. So little tease on that. And we're going to start to tease some of the second round options the Dolphins have. We also had the Dolphins with owners meetings, and Mike McDaniel spoke today. So we're going to react to some of the things that he had to say, talk about 10 and the latest order of attention that he had this weekend. All that fun stuff coming your way here this week on Locked On Dolphins. Keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It's your team every day. Appreciate you all. I'll talk to you all again soon.